with him and has found a good start in this tournament thus far, 2-0.
And Justin's deck is a little bit different. Normally you see these Judith decks trying to like accrue value, maybe have some sort of sacrifice outlet and use that alongside Judith to control your opponent's battlefield presence, but Justin is doing things differently, has things like Heartfire, Dreadhorde Butcher. He is very much an aggressive deck. Also, Fireblade Artist, Heroic Reinforcements. He's here to kill people.
Yeah, I like the look of what Justin's doing quite a bit. It's funny, too, even outside the Commander Arena, still leaning on those powerful legends. There you see a look at our players' hands. Love this new hand cam here on SCG. Justin with a fairly nice start there. Looks like he's got 1-drop into 2-drop. Exactly what this deck wants to be doing. Meanwhile, Dilks is going to be looking to leverage that Kaya's Wrath into the late game. Justin going to go ahead, play a land, untapped, and follow up with Grim Initiate, one of our new additions here from War of the Spark.
I did not think that Grim Initiate was going to be the first card from War of the Spark that I would see on the battlefield, but here we are.
Yeah, there you go. It's there, and it's followed up by a Fireblade Artist who's going to rush into the red zone. 3 points of damage heading Dilks' way. He's going to fall to 17 right off the bat. Goes ahead and untaps, takes a draw.
If you're Dilks playing Esper Control, basically widely considered to be one of the best decks in the format, if not for Simic Nexus, it's number 1 or number 2, right?
Agreed.
And your opponent starts with Grim Initiate into Fireblade Artist. How scared are you?
It depends on your configuration, I think, because I think one of the problems these Judith decks had for a long time is they were really being farmed by Cry of the Carnarium. I think that's a card that in early days of Standard, people are going to try and get away with not playing. And in fact, Dilks does not have a copy of Cry of the Carnarium in his main deck. So if Judith can leverage some of the stickiness that some of its threats has, then Justin Parnell may be able to find some victories here. But I think once Cry of the Carnarium shows up, Dilks is going to get a lot more comfortable with the matchup.
Yeah, look at the amount of value that Cry of the Carnarium would deal here. And Parnell rightfully choosing to just go for it effectively. Like, if you sit back on this 3 points a turn, you're not really going to accomplish a whole lot. And
absolutely.
You're not even sure how many Cry of the Carnariums your opponent might have in their deck. And I've seen this trend a lot with people sharing their deck lists on Twitter and even at the Arena deck list account. People are cutting back on Cry of the Carnarium and just leaning on Kaya's Wrath. And I think for the early stages of a format, that's probably a fine place to be because you don't know if there's going to be a lot of white aggro decks, red aggro decks, or green aggro decks. So.
Right, hard to choose your removal efficiently. You want to go with as broad as possible of a spell, and Kaya's Wrath is in fact that. There you see Cast Down targeting that hero of Precinct 1. Tide Taker, I'm sorry. A little similar in art.
1 dub, 2 power, has stuff to do with tokens.
Right. There comes that Spirit token from the Tide Taker. So Parnell still with a fine battlefield presence, even after facing down a removal spell. Going to go ahead and swing in for 4 points of damage. That's going to drop Dilks down to 10. And here's a follow-up Tithe Taker. It's so critical here. That is going to take Dilks off of Kaya's Wrath mana on this turn.
Well, he can still Wrath, but Parnell has set himself up pretty well where he has the Grim Initiate dice trigger, he has the Tide Taker dice trigger, so he still ends up with a little bit of a battlefield presence even after this sweeper. But had the sweeper been Cry the Carnarium, that would have just not been a thing.
Right. My apologies. I've been playing too much Death and Taxes in Legacy lately. I got excited and I thought I had a new Thalia here. Here's a follow-up, though, from Justin Parnell. Another new War of the Spark card. It's Dreadhorde Butcher.
Yet another dice trigger.
Yeah, more value if it's removed. And Dreadhorde Butcher gets big very fast. You have to think, as far as matchup goes, there's not many better places for Dreadhorde Butcher than up against Esper Control. There's not going to be any blockers in the way of that 1/1 body. It's going to do its thing, grow larger, and eventually present some damage.
Yeah, definitely. And it's one of the cards that could also get under Cry of the Carnarium. Like, you could grow to a 3/3 if you're on the play.
Sure, great point. And here you see a follow-up Dreadhorde Butcher. The hits keep coming off the top of Justin Parnell's deck. And all these creatures are going to rush right into the red zone. Dilks going to tap a bunch of mana here. Has a Vraska's Contempt. That's going to take care of the larger Dreadhorde Butcher. But still, we're getting in some points of damage here.
Yeah, Dilks end up taking 1 damage on this attack. Dice trigger from that Dreadhorde Butcher is going to be another 2 if it comes to that. So Dilks is definitely in some trouble here.
I think so, and he's using his Search for Escanta to try and find answers off the top of the deck. Having to think about this top card now.
it's got to be a good one. There are so few cards that you would want in this situation. You know, like if the card is medium, I think you just have to put it into the graveyard.
It was an island, looks like. And Dilks saying that's not what I can use right now. Did Dilks find an answer for this army off the top of the library? Will be facing down a lethal attack this turn. Dilks going to go ahead, tap 5 mana here. That's Teferi. That card hasn't gone anywhere. In fact, he's just created more copies of himself post-War of the Spark. Edgar sent me a message on Twitter. He said, you know how people say, oh, I wish I could play 7 of this card in my deck? He said he feels that way about Teferi, so he did just, in fact, play 7 copies of Teferi in his deck.
Well, they're not the same.
They're not the same. I agree, Jerry. But you get what he's saying.
I do. Could always go down the Spark double rabbit hole.
Sure.
Played against Ken Yukihiro on Arena the other day, and he was Spark doubling, trying to make as many Planeswalkers as possible.
Yeah, Spark Double, an interesting card. I think it's going to be hard for some of those, we'll say trixier cards to shine, just because this format is so ruthless in so many ways. There are these polar points of aggression as well as control in the form of Esper Control, and then there's just the mid-range obliterator in the form of Simic Nexus. Dilk's going to go ahead and fire off a removal spell on that Butcher, and importantly, it's a bounce spell, actually. It's Tyrant Scorn, and that's going to return the Butcher to hand, so the Dies trigger does not go off.
Yeah, no Dies trigger from the Butcher or from the Cruel Celebrant that Parnell played, which
correct
is okay, but if you're Dilks, you still have to deal with the Celebrant, the 2 tokens, the Dreadhorde Butcher
problems
in hand. Yeah,
he's got real problems, and can he find a way out?
One of the best cards, I think, would be something like Oath of Kaya. Removal spell that also gains you life, kind of gives you a little bit of breathing room.
And Dilks does have 2 copies of Oath of Kaya in his deck this weekend. I've talked to players about that card. Opinions are mixed right now. Some people think it's good, some people think it's a little clunky. Dilks, though, is a fan. 2 copies.
I think it's good. It would have been a sideboard card for me.
Okay. So really it depends on your expected metagame.
Well, even in this world with all the 3-mana Planeswalkers, Oath of Kaya can usually just take one of those out.
Right. So Dilks is going to go ahead and tuck that Cruel Celebrant away. Has a follow-up. It's Kaya's Wrath. And that's going to clear the board. And Dilks looking to have somewhat stabilized on 2 life. We do know, though, Parnell with a hasty attacker in hand. Going to go ahead and deploy a shock land here. Fall to 16. And here comes Heroic Reinforcements.
And he's just going for it. He's been sitting on this Heroic Reinforcements for so long.
And it's going to get the job done. And Justin Parnell picks up game 1 against Matthew Dilks. Mardu Judith victorious over Esper Control. And I think Parnell had to get that game 1 because I do think things get much tougher for the Mardu Judith deck in post-board games. Why don't we start over on Dilks' side, where we're looking at 4 Thief of Sanity, 2 Duress, 2 Cry of the Carnarium, 2 Voner Butcher of Magan, not a card we see all that often, 2 Hostage Taker, 1 Moment of Craving, 1 Teferi Time Reveler, and finally 1 Dovin's Veto. Jerry, what are you doing here if you're Matthew Dilks?
I think normally if you knew that your opponent was just playing a Judith deck, you might sideboard a little bit differently, but given how aggressively slanted Parnell's deck very obviously is, I think Dilks has to just basically treat Parnell's deck like he's a mono-red deck. So things like Vona should probably come in, Moment of Craving, certainly Cry of the Carnarium, and maybe Hostage Taker, not necessarily like expecting to get a lot of good value from it, but it is just a 2/3 body that blocks reasonably.
It's enough. It's enough. I agree with you. Meanwhile, over on Justin Parnell's side, we are looking at 4 Duress, 3 Tocatli Guard, 3 Shock, 3 Despark, 2 Sorin Vengeful Bloodlord. Jerry, what are you doing here if you're Justin?
Definitely like the Duresses a lot. I'm pretty sure that between Simic Nexus and Esper Control, that is the matchup specifically that those are here for. You definitely want to use Duress to trade with a sweeper and let you know kind of what removal spells you have to play around. And Sorin is a nice source of like recursive damage and also just a way to bring your important threats back on the battlefield, and it's a pretty good response to a sweeper. Other than that, you could do things like bring in Despark, but it's not really the game plan that you want to be enacting. You're not too worried about like their Teferis and stuff like that. You'd much rather just be focusing on getting your opponent from 20 to 0.
Right. You don't want to get too reactive in these post-board games. Real quick, looking over Justin's deck, what are you looking to get rid of if you're in the position of the Judith deck? I'm assuming things like Heartfire that leave you a little vulnerable to counter magic. Maybe the Mortifies if you're not super concerned about creatures. But that's always the dance, right? These Esper control decks always capable of bringing in threats in post-board games. And of course, we mentioned Vona, Butcher of Magan, ready to come down. Justin will probably need to answer that card if he's going to find success in this matchup.
Probably, but I think that the Mardu deck is one that can beat a giant life-linking threat.
Okay.
Maybe not easily, but it is still very possible. And I don't think that I would keep Mortify in the dark expecting something like Vona or Lyra. I think for the most part, you just get rid of stuff like that. And the weaker threats, maybe. Things like a couple Footlight Fiends can probably go. Maybe Cruel Celebrant is not as powerful as you'd want. And certainly anything with a Dice Trigger I would want to keep around. The Grim Initiates, the Tithe Takers for sure. Heartfire, I don't really mind all that much because of the combo potential with Dreadhorde Butcher.
Okay.
And the fact that it does deal a lot of damage. And if your opponent uses Cry the Carnarium, Kaya's Wrath, sweeps your board repeatedly, you might want a way to actually have reach and be able to close the game that doesn't involve creatures.
We'll have to see what Justin thinks. Meanwhile, if you're itching to play with these brand new War of the Spark cards, you can order right here at Star City Games. Go.starcitygames.com/war. Getting your orders for War of the Spark right now. I think there's so many impactful cards in this set. And one of the things that I think kind of escaped our notice on first pass was just how deep these cards were going to go in the Eternal formats. We're seeing a lot of penetration into Modern. We're seeing penetration into Legacy. And in fact, there's a ton of really, really meaningful Vintage stuff even in this set. So you can always play the lottery a little bit, try and crack a foil Karn or something like that. That's going to be a card that matters in Vintage for a very long time.
I mean, even that card is showing up in Modern because Tron, you can use it to find a Mycosynth Lattice and just lock your opponent out of the game pretty much.
Right. What do you think about those kind of Nouveau Tron decks? Do you think that's an actual angle for those decks to consider, or is it all just flash right now?
It's definitely an angle. It's so powerful if you actually get to do that. It does kind of suck that Tron is very good at playing a Karn Liberated, a Wormcoil Engine, an Ugin, Oblivion Stone, these things that have an immediate impact, whereas Karn Great Creator doesn't necessarily impact the battlefield immediately. It's more so good against, like Tron Mirrors, control decks, things like that, maybe even combo decks. So to me, it seems a little bit sketchy, but certainly that combination is super powerful.
Right. I think it's interesting, too, that in fail states for Tron, it does provide some kind of alternate plan where in a lot of cases you just be sitting there, not unable to cast any of your spells. At least you can do something with your Karn, try and find some way to stem the bleeding, get to 7 mana, and play the big Karn at some point.
Yeah, I mean, you could even do things like play an Expedition map in your sideboard if you wanted to do like weird stuff like that. I don't necessarily think that that's the best approach, but you should definitely have something in mind to Karn for if you don't actually have Tron and a bunch of mana.
Both players on a mulligan to 6 here. Take a little peek at their hand. We do see D-Spark for Justin Parnell, as well as Duress. So we're going to get a full look here at Dilks' hand. Tyrant scoring the only option, and you see the rest of his hand comprised of very, very powerful creatures in the form of Thief of Sanity and Vona, Butcher of Magan. Yeah,
we knew the Vona was going to come in. Thief of Sanity was one of the cards that people started utilizing in more and more matchups.
Right.
I think the mono blue aggro was the first one where it's like, oh, it's actually good here. And then people started trying to bring it in against the white aggro decks. And it's like, oh, it's pretty good in this matchup too. So I'm not super surprised to see Dilks lean on it here. There are probably a lot of clunkier cards that he can shave to make room for a cheaper threat like this.
All right. And there is that Thief of Sanity that's going to enter the battlefield. But Midnight Reaper is here.
One of the best cards in the matchup by far.
Absolutely, yeah.
And being able to use Duress to clear the way, to actually protect the Midnight Reaper, but it is going to be tough when trying to fight through this Thief of Sanity too, because it's likely going to give Dilks a bunch of blockers.
And here comes Thief of Sanity. Dilks going to go ahead and take a look at those top cards of Justin's deck. Not much of a choice there. There are a couple lands floating around.
Mills 2 red sources.
Yeah, and Justin with the Judith stuck in hand right now, so relevant. Don't think that's what he was intending, but sometimes it just works out that way. This is a nice 1-2 punch for Justin, but small advantages fade very quickly in the face of a Thief of Sanity that's just doing damage and finding new cards, new threats. Justin going to see the uncastable Judith alongside that Despark. Knows he has access to Vona on the next turn. See if he's going to take Despark here and try and protect it. Or if he fears the top deck red source. It is going to be the Despark.
Yeah, it's kind of a tough call. It's one of those decisions that basically matters what is in Dilks' hand and what he got off the Thief of Sanity.
And the get off of Thief of Sanity was Dreadhorde Butcher. Not the best card for Esper Control to wrangle away. Doesn't play defense all that well, but it's going to be put on the task anyway. And we are going to see a block. Dreadhorde Butcher on Tithe Taker. Two are going to trade. Dilks takes 3 damage, falls down to 15. And we're going to have some triggers here. Parnell going to draw a card off the Midnight Reaper. There's a lot of flicking cards back and forth presently.
Yeah, I think Dilks may be wondering if he could actually kill the Spirit made from the Tithe Taker, but Spirit is not yet on the battlefield for him to target when the Dreadhorde Butcher's dice trigger happens.
Nice follow-up here from Parnell in the form of another Tithe Taker as well as Cruel Celebrant. Here comes Thief of Sanity into the red zone. Let's take a look at those top 3, please.
Short of color, but still making enough stuff happen.
Mm-hmm. And Dilks does have that 5th land, and it's time for Vona to hit the battlefield, and that is going to slow up this ground-based offense pretty dramatically.
Yeah, Parnell still has a lot going on with Cruel Celebrant and Midnight Reaper, so he's going to be able to actually continue playing the game still, despite facing down Thief of Sanity and Vona. But this is basically the part of the game where the Esper Control deck starts to stabilize, maybe starts doing things a little bit bigger than the opposing deck, going over the top of them. And it's especially rough with Parnell picking up another uncastable red card in the form of Heartfire. But if he manages to get into combat here and get some Midnight Reaper triggers, he could actually try and draw a red source for the Heartfire or for the Judith, but just ends up passing.
Interesting decision from Parnell. And I think there's an interesting decision on Dilks' side, too. How offensive can this Vona get? I'm assuming it just hangs back, playing some defense, but there are board states that Parnell could assemble. You know, if he gets a second Cruel Celebrant, if he finds the Judith, all those things would be problematic for Dilks in a longer game.
Yeah, this might be one of the situations where you actually want to try and trade off the board a little bit because it just weakens all of the different synergies from the Mardu Judith deck.
Right. Here is a nice find from Dilks. Oath of Kaya. Going to come down, do 3 damage, gain 3 life. That's going to take care of that Midnight Reaper, and that's going to change the complexion of this battlefield quite a bit now, as it looks like both creatures head into the red zone. Vona with that 4/4, Vigilant, life-linking body, Thief of Sanity in the air, trying to take a peek at 3 more cards off the top of Justin's deck.
And with Midnight Reaper gone now, you don't mind trading off Vona for basically the remainder of what Justin has. He's gonna be left with a Spirit from the Tithe Taker if he wants to trade all 3 things for Vona, but that's really not that big of a deal. And then things like Judith, Heroic Reinforcements, even the Heartfire that Justin has. These cards get so much worse.
Yeah, these Judith decks are essentially critical mass decks. You need a bunch of pieces all together, and that's the thing about the pressure of the Cry of Carnarium is that you just don't play well in the face of those kind of cards that can deal with multiple resources. You don't have enough engines to overcome that. Even something like Midnight Reaper just doesn't hold up in the face of Cry. Although here, we're just doing it with creatures. It's been enough. Parnell just passes the turn back. Looks like with a grip full of red cards at this point.
Yeah, the mulligan was not kind to him, certainly. And now he's just so far behind with Thief of Sanity in Vona. Just continually accruing advantage for Dilks and slowly closing the door on this game.
You know, I think these decks in the last format had these same mana issues. This is an ambitious mana base. It's one that does quite a bit of damage to itself, and the spread of cards across colors, pretty broad. You're asking for a good amount of red, a good amount of black, and a good amount of white. It's mostly a pretty even distribution, and that's tough to do successfully, and Parnell agrees it's not going to happen in this game. Scoops up the cards, and we get ready to head to Game 3. It's the key to Parnell finding a way into this Game 3. He's on the play now. That's got to matter a lot for this deck, right?
Yeah, certainly. I would, if I were Parnell, I would just be looking to not be as reactive and continue on that beatdown plan and just try and establish a board presence and just keep trying to do your thing and not necessarily be reacting to things like Vona or Teferi. I would just not really be interested in something like D-Spark, especially when you're on the play.
Yeah, I think this is a spot for variable sideboarding on the play and draw, and we do see Parnell reaching back into the deck, hopefully making some of those changes to regain some aggression. You can see how it's problematic to answer cards like Vona, and you certainly want outs to it, but if you just leave yourself short of threats in those early turns, you're not going to be able to make meaningful progress in this game, and at some point, Esper Control's cards are just better.
Right, it's also kind of awkward that D-Spark is good against some of the stuff, like Vona, but Esper has things like Thought Erasure or Absorb, and if you're trying to use D-Spark to stop a Teferi, they've already drawn a card or talked to one of your things, and D-Spark also doesn't deal with Thief of Sanity, so it's just a losing proposition every way around.
Right. One of those cards that lines up in theory. It's answering the cards you're worried about, but in the actual practice of the game may not be quite as effective as you might expect.
Yeah, and if you're doing your thing, Teferi is not even really that much of a problem because hopefully you have some sort of battlefield presence.
Sure, we saw that game 1.
And if your board has gotten swept and they play a Teferi and your response is D-Spark, you're still so far behind, it's probably just, again, like a losing proposition for you.
Right. Yeah, definitely want to see Justin reclaim the aggressive role here. Also would like to see Justin with access to his 3 colors of mana, quite frankly. I think that'll improve his chances quite a bit.
It helps.
Yeah.
It always helps.
Casting your spells, very, very OP.
Yeah, also, Justin has access to Heartfire, which is something that he can use to pull the trigger on basically all the cards we talked about. Thief of Sanity, Vona, Teferi. It handles all that stuff. How many direct answers do you actually need?
Yeah. No, good question. And it's a way to reward that early aggression, too. It can just close the game out in a lot of spots. Players looking at their opening 7s right now. Looks like Parnell is happy. Dilks never looks happy, as we know.
Oh, no, no.
And in fact is not here. Going to go ahead and take a mulligan down to 6. It's a good start for Parnell. Exactly what he wants to see on the other side of the table.
Josh Cho was going into Game 3 of Round 2, and he was on the play. He mulliganed to 6, and his opponent said, yes!
Ooh. So Cho won, right?
Yeah, he did.
Okay.
He did.
Yeah, don't do that. Just a friendly FYI. you might do a little, fist pump internally. Externally.
Keep it to yourself.
Yes, that is not good for him. And the universe rightly punished it in that instance. Dilks taking a look at his 6 here. Slightly less unhappy with this 6. He is going to keep the top card on top. And Parnell's going to kick us off here. Take a look at the player's hands. I think Parnell's lacking white mana in this hand.
Uh-oh. Not again.
And there's another black-red land off the top. Has a play, though, in the form of Fireblade Artist. That's going to get in for 2 points of damage with hasty attack. Midnight Reaper as a follow-up as well, which is nice. But the rest of the hand beyond that point, it's all white cards. He did just pick up a second copy of Midnight Reaper. And here's another attack from that Fireblade Artist. Dilk's going to fall to 16 very quickly. Would love to see something like Cry of the Carnarium here. Plays an untapped land and has the Cry, and you see just how backbreaking that can be for Parnell. Parnell, though, undaunted, follows up. Untapped land here. And Duress, going to take a look at what Dilks is working with. Sees a hand of Thief of Sanity, Kaya's Wrath, Absorb, and 2 lands.
And that's good. It's certainly a good duress. Obviously, you would have preferred to be able to play that on turn 1, figure out the Cry of the Carnarium is coming, and now you're able to take a sweeper when your board has just already been decimated for the most part.
Yeah, maybe a turn too late here. We are going to remove that Kaya's Wrath, and we have a fine follow-up here in the form of Midnight Reaper. Last 2 cards in hand, Tithe Taker, Cruel Celebrant, no white mana available.
Just pretty awkward because even if Parnell draws a white source, he'll only be able to cast 1 spell.
Right. Dilks presently without a second blue on the battlefield, but we do know he has Island in hand. That will be remedied on this turn. Gonna deploy, and here comes Thief of Sanity. Looked pretty good in this matchup, Jerry.
Yeah, so far. I mean, obviously you need help from the sweepers and everything, but this is effectively like a 3 mana Teferi.
Yeah.
You know?
A lot of card advantage from that little 2/2 flyer.
Round 3 pairings are being posted. Once again, 10:30 Sealed Spectacular. Your round 3 pairings are being posted. Please find your seats.
Maybe one of the most game-warping creatures we've ever seen. As soon as Thief of Sanity enters the battlefield, the game becomes about managing that card every single time.
It's a new sub-game, and once you get hit for the first time, you just feel like the game is over.
Yeah, it can often feel that way. Looks like a Cruel Celebrant is going to be the take for Dilks. Hands back 2 lands. Neither was a white source, by the way, so there's no help coming anytime soon for Parnell. Dilks deploys his 5th land as a follow-up here. Tap a little bit of mana, deploy that Cruel Celebrant. I'm the beatdown now, says Dilks.
Also, with Absorb Mana still open, Parnell picked up a copy of Duress last turn and did not cast it, basically waiting for the turn where he actually wants to force through a threat, which basically convinces Dilks to hold open Absorb in the meantime, which I really like. So Parnell is trying to set himself up to actually regain some traction in this game. I'm not sure if it'll be enough, but I definitely like what Parnell is doing.
Yeah, I think the mana woes are just going to prove to be too much for Justin to overcome. Getting hit again with Thief of Sanity. Dilks takes a look at those 3 cards. There is some actual white mana, although I think he's just taking a Dreadhorde Butcher. Yep, there we go. That's going to enter the battlefield. Again, not the best defensive creature I've ever seen, but it's there. Does its thing.
It's free, you know? Yeah. You hit a spell off Thief of Sanity. I think that's fine.
Yeah.
I think you're happy about that.
Looks like the draw was a Grim Initiate. Dilks going to go ahead and double block here on this Midnight Reaper. Are going to have some trades. Some damage heading Justin's way from the triggers on those creatures.
So I think Justin takes 4, Dilks gains 2, and Parnell gets to peel a card.
Grim Initiate as the play, and another red-black land off the top for Parnell, as all of those white cards remain locked away in his hands. How many white sources are we dealing with, Jerry?
12.
It's a fairly low number for a good amount of white cards. I mean, this is certainly outside the norm, not what you expect when you build this deck.
Yeah, he's got 12 white sources for 14 white cards, which isn't the worst. It is kind of awkward that last game he was lacking red, this game he's lacking white.
Right.
We've seen these decks sometimes go to things like Unclaimed Territory to try and get the mana to work, but now with Cruel Celebrant being a vampire, Dreadhorde Butcher being a zombie, it's a little more difficult to actually get the creature types to line up.
Yeah, it feels like we've gotten too far afield at this point, and that's not really possible anymore. Here is a Thought Erasure from Dilks, and he says, yep, all white cards, that's what I thought. Just going to go ahead and take that Duress away. And I think that's about the death knell here, sitting on Absorb back up, ready to deploy that at any point, as well as a Footlight Fiend.
Yeah, the Footlight Fiend is game over, obviously.
That's the icing on the cake. Can't beat that card. There's a Judith off the top. It's an actual castable Magic card. Justin has to be excited to see one of those.
Sort of. I mean, you know your opponent has Absorb at the ready.
Yep, and Dilks is going to deploy that. go back up to 13 life, very comfortable against this Mardu Judith deck. Just facing down this Thief of Sanity, which has just generated persistent advantage, as the card often does. How about some attacks? Footlight Fiend getting aggressive now. Are going to go ahead and block. Some triggers. Going to throw one at that Grim Initiate. So we get to amass one. Zombie army hits the battlefield.
Keep forgetting that Grim Initiate has first strike.
Yeah. Body a little bit more relevant than a lot of those other plinkers.
Well, it's pretty nice, especially with things like Judith, heroic reinforcements, different ways to actually pump up its power.
No, I think it matters. I think it matters quite often. There is a white source for Justin Parnell. I'm sure he is overjoyed to see that. It's not going to matter one bit, but it feels nice to cast spells.
Hey, too little, too late, you know?
Yeah, unfortunate turn of events for Justin Parnell. I think his hand, even lacking white, was pretty well set up to deal with anything besides Cry of the Carnarium. And that is exactly what Dilks had.
Yeah, especially after he picked up the second copy of Midnight Reaper.
Right.
If you got to play Fireblade Artist into Reaper, Kaya's Wrath is certainly going to be a big tempo play, right? But Parnell is going to have the biggest reload of all time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you only fear Cry in that spot. But Cry remains a problem for these Judith decks, one that they'll definitely have to figure out if they're going to be part of this metagame going forward. Because I only expect more copies of Cry as time goes on. And there you see, hands are extended. Matthew Dilks takes down Justin Parnell 2-1, Esper control over Mardu Judith. And Dilks, fine start to another tournament, 3-0, obviously got 2 of those on bye, but picks up his first win. Love to see that early on as he battles to hold on to that #1 slot in our race for the Players' Championship.